If you're like pretty much everyone I know, you've got this constant feeling in your gut that everything just costs more.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the gas for your car, the groceries, your rent. It just feels like it's creeping up and sometimes jumping up from last year.
That's inflation. It's that slow erosion of what your dollar can actually buy.
Exactly. And for decades, the entire economic world, from policymakers to your pension fund, has relied on this one massive, unbelievably complex number to track that feeling, the Consumer Price Index,
Yeah.
the CPI.
The big one.
Okay, let's unpack this. We always hear the CPI reported as just a single number, right? Inflation is up 4% or 7%, whatever the headline is. But it is anything but simple.
Not at all.
It's the single most closely watched economic statistic on the planet, really, because it has so much leverage. It's the government's best shot at taking a huge weighted snapshot of what we all spend our money on.
The so-called market basket of goods and services.
And that basket is supposed to represent what you, the listener, are buying every month. We've got a fantastic stack of sources today that really get into the weeds of how this colossal number is built, why it's always so controversial, and what the tiny choices in its calculation mean for your wallet.
It really is the metric that tries to, I guess, arbitrate economic reality for a whole country. And its main function is, on the surface, pretty straightforward.
Just tracking price changes.
Right. Tracking price changes over time. If the CPI goes up by, say, 5% over a year, it means that basket of typical household stuff now costs 5% more.
But the stakes are just immense.
Oh, absolutely. Because those changes, that percentage, it's not just a number on a screen. It's hardwired into the economy. It's used to index or adjust the real value of wages.
It determines Social Security payment.
It determines pensions, it regulates prices for utilities, and critically, it lets us deflate all these huge monetary numbers so we can actually see if the economy is growing in real inflation-adjusted terms.
And this is the big but we're going to keep coming back to.
Our sources are crystal clear on this. While it's indispensable, the CPI is, and I'm quoting here, not a perfect measure of inflation or the cost of living.
It's an approximation. It has to be. It's a necessary compromise, really, between what economists would consider a perfect theoretical ideal and the practical reality of needing a reliable number fast every single month.
And it's in those compromises, those little judgment calls, that you find all the intense economic and, frankly, political fights that are always swirling around this number.
That's where all the debate lives.
And so today, we're going to trace the history of this market basket idea. Then we're going to dive right into the mechanics of how statistical agencies like the BLS actually handle this mountain of data.
The weighting, the collection, all of it.
Then we're getting into the deep water, the single biggest, most heated controversy in the entire index, which is what, over 40% of the whole thing?
Housing.
How in the world do you accurately measure the cost of owning a home?
The billion-dollar question. And finally, we'll look at all the different flavors of the CPI they use here in the U.S., that whole alphabet soup of acronyms, and what they mean for policy, especially for Social Security.
The cost of living adjustments, or COLAs.
Right. So let's start at the beginning. The anatomy of the basket itself. Where did this idea even come from?
Well, the idea of trying to quantify this feeling of rising prices, it's not new at all. It actually has some surprisingly simple historical roots.
We're not talking about something from the 1970s then.
No, not even close. The concept of a price index was first proposed by an English economist, Joseph Lowe, way back in 1822.
Wow. Okay, so what did his version look like? I'm picturing something a lot simpler than what we have today.
Oh, much simpler. It was beautiful in its simplicity, really. Lowe's whole approach was just an elementary comparison. He said, let's compare the total price of a fixed basket of goods and services in one period. Call it period zero.
The starting point.
With the total price of the exact same fixed basket in the next period. Period one. That's it.
So that basic idea, the fixed basket, that's still the DNA of what we do now, even with all the supercomputers and, modern economic theory.
It is. That fixed basket approach remains the elementary basis of our current systems. We establish a list of what people buy, and we just track its price over time.
It sounds so manageable when you put it like that, but then you try to apply that to, 330 million people buying millions of different things?
And it scales out of control very, very quickly.
So let's ground this with the actual math, but for just one item to make sure we get the mechanism.
Good idea. So if we look at just one specific thing, let's say a gallon of milk, the single item price index is calculated by taking its current updated cost.
What it costs today.
Right. And you divide that by what it costs in the base period, and then you multiply that whole thing by 100.
Okay, so if the base year is, say, 1982, and milk cost $1 then, and today it costs $4, the math is 4 divided by 1 times 100. The index for milk is 400.
Exactly right. And that multiplication by 100, that's just a convention. It's a way to rescale the entire time series so that the base period value is always 100.
It just creates a nice, clean starting point for
It's
comparison.
a consistent benchmark, yep. And this index is then reported monthly or quarterly, comparing prices now with those in that established price reference month.
Okay, now let's talk scale, because this is where the simple theory just smacks right into the wall of reality. That simple formula for milk has to be done, what, thousands and thousands of times?
Tens of thousands. Our sources get into the sheer volume here. In the United States, the Bureau of Labor Statistics collects and averages prices for approximately 85,000 specific items,
85,000.
sourced from 22,000 different stores and 35,000 rental units.
I mean, just think about that. That means there are actual people, statisticians, whose job it is to track the price of a specific brand of laundry detergent in a specific type of store in a specific city month after month after month.
It's a logistical and mathematical Everest. It really is. And all of that data then has to be compiled into one single cohesive number.
The weighted average?
The weighted average, exactly. A weighted average of all those thousands of item area indices. And the weight that's assigned to each item just reflects how much we as consumers spend on it.
Right. So the index for gasoline matters a whole lot more than the index for, I don't know, chewing gum.
Precisely. Because we spend a heck of a lot more on fuel than we do on gum.
So before we get into how those weights are decided, which sounds like its own can of worms, we should talk about the exclusion zone. What gets deliberately left out of the basket? Because sometimes what's missing tells you a lot about what the index is trying to do.
That's a really critical point. The CPI is designed first and foremost to measure current consumption.
Okay, so things we use up.
Right. So anything related to saving or investing or capital formation, it's always excluded.
So my stock portfolio, my 401k contributions, none of that is in there.
Nope, not factored in at all.
And there's a geographic limit, too.
Yes, the CPI is a domestic measure. So consumer spending that happens abroad is usually excluded. The goal is to focus on the price changes that residents experience inside the country's borders.
Now, the third exclusion, this one is, I think, the most politically interesting one, taxes.
Yeah.
Our source gives this example where taxes made up a staggering 43% of the final cost of a good, but those taxes are completely left out of the CPI calculation. Why?
Well, the CPI is generally designed to measure the price paid for a good or service before most consumption taxes are applied. Things like income tax are definitely out. The idea is to track the price of the commodity itself, not government policy.
But the implication there is huge, isn't it?
It is. If a government decides to shift how it taxes people, say, it lowers income taxes, which are excluded from the CPI, but raises sales taxes, which might be included but often aren't.
Then the CPI might not actually show the real increase in what you're paying at the checkout.
Exactly. It might only capture the change in the product's price, completely missing the change in tax policy that's making it more expensive for you.
Wait a minute. So if a government has an incentive to keep that headline CPI number low, maybe to avoid paying out higher Social Security adjustments, they could, in theory, shift the tax burden in a way that the CPI doesn't fully capture.
It creates a potential statistical or political incentive.
Absolutely.
Because the CPI is the benchmark for so much, how you define what's in and what's out can have massive budgetary consequences. It's a very fine line to walk.
And then the last exclusion is sometimes entire groups of people.
That's right, especially for more specialized indices.
Yeah.
The goal is always to measure the experience of the average consumer.
So the outliers get trimmed.
Sometimes. In the UK's old retail price index, the RPI, they used to specifically exclude the very highest income households and certain low-income pensioner households. The argument was that their spending patterns were just too different from the median experience and would skew the average. It just goes to show that even defining who the representative consumer is, that's a statistical and sometimes political choice in itself.
So even after all this incredible data collection, all the exclusions, all the weighting, it's still just an approximation.
It is.
You mentioned that economists have this sort of holy grail, the true cost of living index.
They do. They call it the constant utility index.
Constant utility. Okay.
In theory, this perfect index would measure exactly how much more money you'd need to maintain the exact same standard of living, the same level of satisfaction, or utility, even as prices change around you.
So if steak prices double, the perfect index would track how much you'd need to spend on, I don't know, chicken or pork to be just as happy as you were before.
That's the idea. It accounts for substitution.
That sounds incredibly useful, so why don't we just use that?
The problem is speed. A perfect constant utility index can only really be calculated retrospectively. It requires these huge, complex sets of consumer behavior data that take months or even years to properly analyze.
But the CPI has to come out now.
It has to be released monthly, within weeks of the data being collected. And that need for speed forces a pragmatic approximation. And that approximation usually takes the form of a fixed-weight index, what's technically known as a L'Esper's index.
Let's break that term down, L'Esper's index, because that's really the technical name for this fixed basket problem, isn't it?
It is. The easiest way to think about a true L'Esper's index is to imagine you're stuck with the exact shopping list you used in the base year, let's say 2010.
Okay.
Even if over the next 10 years you completely stopped buying CDs and started buying streaming subscriptions, or you stopped buying beef because it got way too expensive, the index assumes you are still buying the original 2010 quantity of CDs and beef.
Which means it's inherently overestimating inflation.
Exactly.
Because it doesn't see us doing the smart thing and switching to cheaper alternatives.
It suffers from what's called substitution bias, precisely because it can't track those rapid changes in our behavior in real time. It's essentially using yesterday's economy to calculate today's prices.
So we've laid the foundation, but now we get to the really tricky part. The devil is in the details, and for the CPI, the biggest detail is the structure of the weights. This is the recipe, right? It's the proportion of each ingredient in the basket. If you get the weights wrong, the final headline number is just wrong.
That's absolutely correct. The weights are just the proportions assigned to all the different spending categories. They have to sum up to 100%, of course. And they are what define the statistical picture of that typical consumer.
Let's use the U.S. expenditure weights from our sources to really anchor this. Housing is the elephant in the room. It makes up 41.4% of the U.S. CPI.
A massive chunk.
I mean, nearly half of all measured inflation is being driven by what happens with housing costs.
And that huge percentage right there, it instantly tells you why the housing controversy we're about to discuss is so high stakes.
Right. But okay, moving down the list, what are the next biggest pieces?
After housing, you've got food and beverages at 17.4%, and then transport is right on its heels at 17.0%.
So those three, housing, food, and transport, that's the vast majority of the index.
It is. After that, you see medical care, which is a huge point of policy debate, at 6.9%, then apparel at 6.0%, entertainment at 4.4%, and then a catch-all other category at 6.9%.
So if some crisis makes gas prices soar by, say, 50% overnight, that's going to have a much, much bigger impact on the final CPI number than if, I don't know, movie ticket prices did the same.
Of course, the weights are the leverage points in the whole equation.
Yeah.
And they're constructed through this layered system, what statisticians call the hierarchy of indices.
You can't just jump from those 85,000 individual items to the final number. It has to be built up in stages.
Right. It's an aggregation process.
So let's clarify that hierarchy. What's at the very bottom, the most granular level?
At the very bottom, you have what are called elementary aggregates. This is the price of a very specific type of good in a very specific place. The example from the source is something like the price of men's short-sleeved cotton shirts sold in San Francisco department stores.
That's specific.
That's specific. It has to be. Because price movements are so localized and so dependent on the type of store, a shirt at a discount store in one city costs something very different than at a fancy boutique in another.
So you take all those elementary aggregates and you average them together to form a low-level index, like outer garments, and then those combine into a higher-level sub-index, like clothing, and eventually you get to the big categories we just talked about, like apparel.
Precisely. And it's a standardized process. Even in the European Union, their harmonized index requires every member country to compute about 80 of these prescribed sub-indices just to make sure everyone is building the number in a comparable way.
Okay, but here's a huge practical problem that jumps out at me. The unweighted challenge. If you're the statistician tracking the price of those shirts in San Francisco, do you actually know the sales volume of brand A versus brand B, or how many were sold on sale versus at full price?
Often, no. That's the problem. At that lowest, most granular level of the elementary aggregate, the detailed sales data you need for perfect weighting, it's just not available to the statistical office.
So what do?
They know the average price of the 10 different shirts they're tracking, but they don't know the market share of each of those 10 shirts. So they often have to compute the price using an unweighted arithmetic or geometric mean.
They just average them.
They just average the prices together, basically assuming that each shirt they're tracking contributes equally to what people are buying, which, of course, we know is almost never true.
That feels like a bit of a weak link in the chain, you know? Relying on a simple average right at the foundation.
It has been for a long time, but the data landscape is changing very, very quickly.
Which brings us to barcode scanner data.
The game changer. Our sources really highlight this. This technology is slowly making it possible to have real weights, even at that most detailed level.
So instead of a person with a clipboard writing down a price.
Exactly. Instead of that, scanner data gives the statistical office the actual sales volumes for specific products. Brand X, SKU number Y plus where it was bought, and the exact price paid, including any discounts.
So scanner data is finally getting the index a little closer to that constant utility ideal by cutting down on that substitution bias at the ground level.
It is, and it helps with the whole data collection process itself. It addresses a major operational problem, which is what they call respondent burden.
Making it easier for the people who participate in the surveys.
Right. One source mentions Statistics Iceland found that when people in their surveys are given detailed cash register receipts from scanner purchases, they don't have to write down every single item they bought in a diary.
They can just keep the receipt.
They just record the total and keep the receipt. It dramatically reduces the burden on them. It increases the accuracy of what was bought. And crucially, it gives you that specific point of purchase data.
So you know if it was bought at a supermarket versus a corner store.
Which helps you estimate those outlet-type weights we were just talking about. It's a huge leap forward.
Okay, so we've got the weights and we've got the data sources, these periodical household expenditure surveys and the big national accounts. But these two sources don't always line up perfectly, do they?
No, they don't. And managing that divergence is a huge part of the job. For instance, a household survey usually excludes what foreign visitors spend. But the national accounts, they track total consumption in the whole economy, including tourists.
So you have to adjust for that.
You have to adjust. Or, on the flip side, the national accounts include something called imputed rent for people who own their homes, an estimate of what the rental value would be. A household survey might only look at what people actually paid out of pocket. So you have to harmonize those different definitions.
What's really fascinating here, and something I think most people miss, is that this isn't just about counting how many dollars were spent on beef nationally.
No, it's so much more complex.
You have to account for regional differences and store-type differences all at the same time.
It's exponential complexity. I mean, the ideal would be to estimate the spending for every single detailed category, for every single type of outlet in every single region of the country.
Which is impossible.
It's impossible. So you have to make educated estimates. You might lack detailed regional data. So you assume that, say, the northern region, which has 24% of the population, also consumes 24% of all sliced bread.
A rough proxy.
A rough but necessary proxy.
Okay.
Then you apply the national outlet data, say 70% of sliced bread is sold in supermarkets, to get an estimate for sliced bread sold in supermarkets in the northern region. They use every scrap of data they have because a rough estimate is better than ignoring that spending completely.
And even with all this incredibly meticulous work, the whole system still suffers from what you called the cost of infrequency.
The reweighting problem.
Right. This is the Las Spares index problem in the real world.
It is. Ideally, the weights in the CPI would reflect what we're spending our money on right now, this year. But in reality, they're historical.
They're always looking in the rearview mirror.
They are. They reflect spending patterns from the last big survey, which might be a year or two old. Reweighting is incredibly expensive and labor-intensive for statistical offices, so they just can't do it constantly.
And the result of that is that the index is always chasing a moving target. It creates this huge time lag before new types of products ever get into the basket.
A significant delay. The sources give two perfect examples: internet service subscriptions and digital cameras.
Okay, what happened there?
When digital cameras first exploded in popularity, they initially had to be lumped into the same elementary aggregate as film cameras.
But there's a completely different technology.
Completely different. But the basket structure hadn't been updated to give them their own category yet. So if a brand new category just appears on the market like VR headsets or some new digital service, the official CPI basically pretends it doesn't exist until the next big reweighting cycle.
Which means the official inflation rate for that whole period is fundamentally incomplete. The older the weights get, the more the official number diverges from our actual lived reality.
Okay.
So we've established that housing is the single biggest piece of the pie, 41.4% in the U.S.
The 800-pound gorilla.
And now we are wading into the philosophical deep end. Because measuring the cost of owner-occupied housing might be the single most divisive, controversial element in all of statistics.
It's a genuine dilemma because a house, it's two things at once. It's this massive, long-term, durable asset, an investment,
Right.
and it's also something that provides a continuous consumption service,
Yeah.
shelter. The whole problem is, how do you surgically separate the consumption cost from the investment component?
So let's break down the three competing ways to do this. Approach one, the economist's view, which is all based on opportunity cost.
The core idea here is that a homeowner is consuming the service that the house provides, and that service is basically identical to what a renter gets.
Okay, so the cost isn't what you pay on the mortgage.
No. The true cost in this view is the opportunity cost, is what the owner gives up by living in the house themselves instead of, say, renting it out to someone else.
And the most famous version of this is the rental equivalent approach, which is what the U.S. largely uses.
Right. Under this approach, the cost of owning your home is the rent you could get if you leased it out. You're trying to price the service of shelter.
But the practical problem seems huge.
It is. How do you estimate the rental value of a house that isn't for rent? If you live in a unique 5-bedroom house and there are no other 5-bedroom houses for rent anywhere near you, the statisticians have to find comparable properties.
Maybe 2 3-bedroom apartments?
Maybe. And then they have to statistically adjust for the differences. And that whole process is just full of error and subjectivity.
So what's the other side of that opportunity cost coin, the alternative cost approach?
This one defines the cost differently. It looks at the capital expense. It asks, what is the interest the owner would have earned if they sold the house, invested that money for a year, and then bought the house back, after accounting for depreciation?
It's trying to capture the cost of having all that capital tied up in a house instead of in the stock market.
Exactly. But there's a huge problem.
Wait, let me guess. If house prices are going up really fast, the capital gain you get from owning it for that year could be bigger than the interest and the depreciation combined.
You got it. And that could make the cost of housing in the CPI negative.
Which would drag the whole inflation number down even while home prices are soaring.
Right. It creates extreme volatility. If prices rise fast, the cost goes negative. If they suddenly fall, the cost spikes way up. And statisticians absolutely hate that kind of volatility in a headline number.
And you brought this up earlier. There's an intellectual inconsistency here, isn't there? If you use this logic for a house, why not for everything else that lasts a long time?
You should, if you're being logically consistent. Your refrigerator provides a cooling service for 15 years. An appendectomy provides the service of good health for the rest of your life.
My couch, my car.
All durable consumer goods and services should, by this logic, be measured by their rental equivalent or their opportunity cost. The fact that economists generally only apply this incredibly complex logic to housing.
And not to my sofa.
It shows that it's really about the sheer size of the housing category, not about pure theoretical consistency.
Okay, that brings us to the second way. Approach 2, the spending approach, or the debt profile method. This side just says, forget all the theory, let's just track what homeowners actually spend.
This feels the most intuitive to the average person, right? It focuses on the actual outlays. Repairs, maintenance, property taxes, and the big one, mortgage interest payments.
Because that's the bill you see every month.
Right. But the complexity of actually implementing this is kind of horrifying. Because you can't just track current spending. You have to compare it to the spending in the base period.
You have to create a counterfactual.
You do. If you're calculating the CPI today, you have to compare the interest someone is paying now to the interest that would have been paid on a similar house that was bought and mortgaged way back in the original reference period, like 2005 or something.
So you're tracking the historical debt profile of a hypothetical house bought 15 years ago and then adjusting it for today's conditions.
It's a staggering statistical exercise, and it leads directly to the great policy paradox.
Which is, if the central bank raises interest rates to stop inflation, what does this method do to the CPI?
It makes inflation look worse.
Ah.
That rise in interest rates, which is designed to cool the economy, shows up in the debt profile method as a higher cost of homeownership. So it pushes the measured inflation rate up.
It's a broken feedback loop. The cure for inflation looks like more inflation.
Precisely. It makes the index look unstable and counterproductive to the very policy it's supposed to be guiding.
And is this method applied consistently to all our debt? Car loans, credit cards?
No, which is another big consistency failure. If you're going to cover mortgage interest, Logic says you should cover the interest on all consumer credit instead of just the full price of the things bought on credit. But most countries that use this debt profile method don't do that. They treat mortgages as a special case.
Okay, finally, let's get to the third way, approach 3, the transaction prices approach. This seems like the simple, direct method. Just treat a house like you'd treat a washing machine.
This is the most straightforward interpretation. You just use the agreed-upon transaction prices for houses, you ignore all the financing and borrowing stuff, and you only include the sale of new dwellings.
Why only new ones?
You exclude secondhand sales because that's just an asset transfer between two consumers. It's not new consumption for the economy as a whole.
This sounds so much cleaner. But you said it creates a fight between investment and consumption.
This is where the CPI clashes with broader economic measurement. In the big system of national accounts, the purchase of a new house is almost always treated as an investment, as capital formation, not as consumption.
I see.
So if the CPI, which is supposed to be a consumption index, suddenly starts including new houses as consumption, it creates a serious break with all the other major government statistics. And economists really, really want the definition of consumption to be consistent everywhere.
And then there's one last, almost philosophical problem with the land itself.
Right. The argument is that land is this irreproducible, permanent asset. You can't consume land. Therefore, the price used in the CPI should exclude the value of the land underneath the house.
So the statisticians would have to somehow figure out what the empty lot would be worth and subtract that from the sale price of the house?
Yes, which is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to do reliably, especially in a dense city where the house's value is completely tied up with the land's value.
So to sum up the housing confusion, it's this three-way battle. And the reasons it's never been solved are feasibility, volatility, and just plain old logical disagreement.
That's it exactly. Statisticians struggle with the feasibility of getting good data. They worry about the volatility if they include interest rates or capital gains. And the theorists can't agree on which approach is the most logically consistent. It remains the most fundamentally challenging piece of the entire index.
So these fights over data and housing, they're happening all over the world. But here in the United States, the debate gets this specific political urgency because the Bureau of Labor Statistics doesn't compute just one CPI.
No, they compute several, each one aimed at a different population or using a different method.
It's the alphabet soup of U.S. CPIs.
It is. You have the CPI-U for all urban consumers. That's the main headline number you always hear about.
Okay.
Then there's the CPI-W for urban wage earners and clerical workers. There's a rarely used CPI-E for the elderly. And then there's the statistically refined CPI-U, which is the chained CPI for all urban consumers.
And the really crucial thing to understand here is that all of these different indices, they're using the exact same raw price data.
That's right.
They all start with those 8,018 separate item area indices we talked about. The only thing that's different between a CPI-U and a CPI-W is the weights that are applied to that data.
Exactly. The weights are adjusted to reflect the spending patterns of their target population.
So the standard ones, the CPI-U and CPI-W, they use weights that are held constant for 24 months.
Right. They're only updated in January of even-numbered years, which means for up to 2 full years, the index is assuming that you're buying the exact same proportional basket of stuff, no matter what happens to prices.
And that fixed weight structure is exactly why we have the substitution effect problem we talked about earlier. If the price of beef skyrockets, the normal CPI-U just assumes I'm still buying the same amount of beef, even though I've obviously switched to cheaper chicken.
That is the classic substitution bias. And that is exactly what the CPI-U, the chained CPI, was designed to fix.
How does it do it?
The chained CPI updates its weights every month.
Oh, wow.
It immediately reflects changes in our spending patterns. If millions of us substitute chicken for beef, that shift shows up in the very next month's CPI-U calculation.
So it's a much more dynamic, much more accurate measure of what's actually happening.
Statistically, yes, it's a superior measure of inflation because it tracks consumer behavior in almost real time.
And because we consumers always tend to buy the cheaper thing when prices change, the chained CPI has to, by its very nature, run a little lower than the fixed weight CPI-U, right?
That's right. Because the fixed weight one is artificially inflated by pretending we're still stuck buying the expensive items. The chained CPI accounts for our adaptation.
Okay, now let's get to the biggest political pressure point in this whole system, the COLA controversy. The cost of living adjustment for, 70 million Social Security recipients is based on the annual increase in the CPI-W.
The index for urban wage earners and clerical workers.
Yes. And this is just a classic case of a statistical mismatch with huge social consequences.
It is. You're using an index designed for the working population to adjust the incomes of the retired population.
And Social Security recipients are primarily the elderly. And the elderly spend a substantially larger portion of their income on healthcare. Some estimates say between 20 and 40% than younger working people do.
And we all know that for decades, inflation in healthcare has just massively outpaced inflation in the rest of the economy.
So the CPI-W, the index being used for the COLA, severely underweights the one category where seniors are spending most of their money and facing the highest price increases.
Which means the CLA they get may not be adequately compensating them for the real increase in their personal cost of living.
Does the BLS know this is a problem?
Oh, they do. They recognize this, and they actually track the CPI-E, an index specifically for the elderly.
But it's not used for policy.
It is not used, and the reason is purely about the budget. Our sources lay out the brutal economics of it. The Social Security Trust Fund currently has a projected solvency of about 40 years. If we were to switch to using the CPI-E, which is more accurate for seniors and would provide higher annual COLA payments,
It would drain the fund faster.
it's estimated to shorten that solvency forecast by about 5 years.
Wow. So a seemingly neutral statistical choice, which index to use it, has consequences that ripple through the entire federal budget. It literally changes the retirement age and tax burdens for future generations.
The policy implications are just staggering. And this all came to a head and became a huge political flashpoint around 2010 during budget negotiations. And the debate was all about that chain CPI, the CPI-U.
Right. And the proponents, people like former White House Chief of Staff Erskine Bowles, they argued really passionately that we should switch to the chain CPI for COLA adjustments.
This argument was twofold.
Yeah.
It's more accurate, and it saves a ton of money.
Okay.
They argue the CPI-U is a more accurate measure of true inflation because it captures substitution. And switching to it was estimated to save the government over $290 billion over a decade.
And that's because, as we said, the chain CPI always runs a little bit lower than the standard CPI.
Right. Historically, about a quarter to a third of a percentage point lower every year.
So by adopting the more accurate index, the government would save hundreds of billions of dollars by automatically giving out slightly smaller annual increases to federal pensions and Social Security.
That's the dynamic exactly. It was framed as a marriage of fiscal responsibility and statistical accuracy.
But the critics, people like former Labor Secretary Robert Reich and groups representing retired federal employees, they pushed back hard.
Very hard.
What was their argument?
Their argument was that the CPI-U, while maybe it's better at capturing the substitution effect for things like groceries, still completely fails the elderly demographic because of that huge weight of healthcare.
They said it doesn't solve the core problem.
Exactly. They argued it still doesn't adequately address the fact that seniors spend 20 to 40% of their income on these high inflation healthcare costs. They saw it as a backdoor way to cut benefits for the most vulnerable people.
And in the end,
While it was seriously considered during major deficit talks in 2013, the political blowback was just too intense and is not adopted.
so we've got the CPI-U, the W, the E, the CPI-U. With all this variation and controversy, where does the most powerful economic player of all, the Federal Reserve, look for its main signal on inflation?
They use yet another index, the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, or PCEPI.
So why do they prefer that one?
The Fed favors the PCEPI because it believes it addresses some of the CPI's biggest structural flaws. It's a broader measure that comes from the national accounts, not just household surveys. And crucially, it updates its weights more dynamically than the standard CPI-U.
So it's better at handling that substitution effect.
Much better. It's also seen as having a more comprehensive scope across the whole economy.
And the statistical difference between the two, it might seem small, right? We're talking about maybe half a percentage point difference in the historical average.
It seems small, but over the span of a generation, that difference is enormous.
How so?
Historically, inflation, as measured by the PCEPI, has averaged about 3.3% a year. But CPI-measured inflation has averaged 3.8%.
So that 0.5 percentage point difference, it just compounds year after year after year.
It does. Imagine calculating a worker's real wage growth over 30 years using the 3.8% CPI benchmark versus the 3.3% PCEPI benchmark. The real value of your wages, of your savings, of your debt. It all shifts massively.
And the PCEPI showing lower inflation, that's a key reason why the Fed uses it for its 2% long-term inflation target.
It is.
Okay, so let's bring this complex statistical world crashing right into the real world with some recent headlines. Our sources track the U.S. CPI data using 1982 as the base year, where the index is 100. By December of 2021, that CPI reading hit 7%.
And that 7% figure, that was the highest level in over 40 years. It was the headline shockwave that really marked the beginning of a major shift in monetary policy.
So even though the Fed prefers the PCEPI for its long-term thinking,
The CPI is the metric the public sees and feels. And it was that really dramatic CPI signal that prompted the Federal Reserve, under Jerome Powell, to begin aggressive quantitative tightening and start signaling the rate hikes that were expected to kick off in March of 2022.
so the CPI, for all of its flaws, the housing problems, the substitution bias, all of it, it's still the immediate, vital signal that forces the central bank to act. It's the number that makes people feel the heat, even if the Fed is looking at its sibling index for the long-term plan. Hashtag tag Hume tag outro.
So if we try and connect this entire deep dive to the bigger picture, I think what we've really uncovered is that the Consumer Price Index, it's a statistic that's built on a whole series of really difficult philosophical and, frankly, political choices. We've really seen two main battlegrounds that define the whole number.
The first one is that fundamental philosophical problem of how to measure owner-occupied housing.
Right.
Do you choose the subjective but maybe theoretically better opportunity cost method?
Or do you choose the debt payments method that's unstable and creates that policy paradox?
Or do you just choose a transaction price approach that messes up all your other economic statistics? Each path gives you a fundamentally different inflation number.
And the second battleground is that political and social conflict over what's fair versus what's statistically rigorous.
Right. You have the policy choice of which index is the fairest one to use for COLA. Is it the CPI-W, which is designed for workers, not retirees?
Is it the CPI-E, which is demographically perfect for seniors but creates huge fiscal problems down the road?
Or is it the chain CPI, which is statistically more robust but ends up resulting in lower benefit increases for people?
The statistician is in this impossible position of being tasked with both scientific accuracy and managing political consequences.
The CPI is never just about the math. It's a series of policy compromises disguised as a single number. So what does this all mean for you, the listener?
Well, it means that the headline inflation figure you hear, whether it's 2% or 7%, it's never a perfect reflection of your personal experience.
Right.
If you're an elderly person who relies heavily on prescription drugs and hospital visits, your personal inflation rate is almost certainly much higher than the CPI-W suggests.
But if you're a young, adaptable consumer who's really quick to substitute from one product to another when prices change,
your personal inflation rate might actually track much closer to that lower chained CPI figure. Understanding the weights helps you figure out where you sit on that spectrum.
And it really encourages you to see the power in these small statistical choices. That difference between the historical average inflation of the CPI at 3.8% and the PCEPI at 3.3%, that has massive cumulative implications for the real value of your savings, for the future of entitlement programs, and for the purchasing power of your wages over your entire lifetime. That 0.5% can absolutely be the difference between a comfortable retirement and a really strained one.
And the whole process is always one of catch-up. The statisticians are always looking at the past to try and calibrate the present.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you to chew on. If the CPI basket is always being updated periodically every 2 years, every decade, to reflect our current habits, what happens during periods of genuinely rapid, massive behavioral change? Think about the sudden explosion of digital services, the shift from buying CDs and DVDs to streaming, or the huge reliance on virtual everything during the pandemic. If the index is always lagging behind, measuring the prices of yesterday's consumption mix, is it inherently incapable of capturing the true speed of modern inflation? Is the one number we rely on for our most crucial decisions always, by its very nature, a step behind the curve? We'll leave that with you.